Civil Rights Reform Contributors by Mallory Moran. The contributors included civil rights activists and civil rights reformers. Grassroots civil rights activists are people who stood for developing equality in our nation, whether it be for the African American minority, the Mexican immigrants, or any other minority being discriminated against. Civil rights activists took a stand and tried to get the public and the government to enact change to make freedom a possibility for everyone. They are often marked with acts such as peaceful protests, sit-ins, and riots. Civil rights reformers were people who worked in the government, such as the president, congressmen, or politicians. They worked hand in hand when it came to approving, opposing, and assisting with change in the civil rights movement. The common perspective of many civil rights activists was that the government, as well as the common people of the United States of America, were mistreating them. In this picture, a group of white government officials can be seen standing around the body of an unconscious black man. This is the aftermath of a riot that occurred at a public swimming pool. The inactivity of the policemen is a great representation of the perspective of the black man in America at this time. They felt as though, in order to bring change upon the nation, they had to demand it through their protests. In the primary document from Week 9, in a letter to a religious leaders from the South, Martin Luther King states, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." This demonstrates the perspective of the majority of civil rights activists. The faith that the government would back the cause was dwindling, if not already lost, at that time. The perspective of the civil rights reformers or government officials was often that of opposition to the civil rights activists. The African American Society, as well as many immigrant societies, felt as though they were being discriminated against violently. The government officials did not always feel this way. In Primary Document 10, in a recording of conversation between President Lyndon Johnson and his colleague Luther Hodges, the idea that violence was involved in the disappearance of 3 men was nonchalantly dismissed by the latter. This demonstrates the perspective of many civil rights reformers. Many acted dismissively to the issues brought up by the activists, although President Johnson seemed to be cooperating with a number of activists and keeping an open line of communication. The issues between the groups remained. Even those government officials who were conflicted with the situation going on in the U.S. at that time found it difficult to stand against the discriminatory majority. In the primary document from Week 10, a conversation recording between President Johnson and Lee White occurred discussing the murder of a civil rights activist. Lee White discusses how he was asked for help to get the body back to the body's hometown in New Hampshire, and how this put him in a very difficult spot. This would have put anybody in a difficult spot due to the hostility between the groups at the time. The inner workings of the civil rights activists and the civil rights reformers was a complicated one. Although at times they were working towards the same goal, they can often be noted at odds with each other in disagreements. However, on many occasions, in the primary reading documents for Week 10, President Johnson is heard in recordings communicating with them and trying to work with them. Much like the rest of the nation, there were varying opinions taken on the matter of civil rights reform. There were government officials that supported it and the majority that detested the idea. This can be demonstrated by Week 10 primary document readings and a conversation recorded between President Johnson and Martin Luther King, Jr. Martin Luther King, Jr. expresses his frustration with Mayor Yorty and Police Chief Parker. He claims that they are disrespectful and entirely unwilling to help. This demonstrates the reality that many government officials don't support the idea of reform fully, although President Johnson was hearing him out, demonstrating a backing for his cause. In theory, the goals of the civil rights reformers and civil rights activists are one and the same. The entire point of the civil rights reform was to change the laws that prohibited equality of every race in every aspect of life. In the Week 9 primary document, in the testimony of Stokely Carmichael, he states, "We want our people to be able to enjoy a life and to get all of the things they need to have a decent life without having to struggle as hard as they do now because they are economically exploited by the imperialist power structure of the United States." This is what all minority societies wanted. However, the goals of the civil rights reformers were more complex. At this point, many wanted to assist in the goal of the activists. However, many politicians were worried of helping or being put in a bad spot. The main objective of the government officials was to keep violence to a minimum and prevent riots. Civil rights activists were motivated by inequality. Many people who fought so hard for equality, such as famous civil rights activist Martin Luther King, suffered from discrimination caused by inequality. This desperate wish for a world where we all lived equally and peacefully propelled many to dedicate their lives to this fight. In a document written by Martin Luther King Jr., he states that through actions such as sit-ins and peaceful protests, the community cannot avoid the confrontation. They will be forced to then reassess the cries for change. The unjust treatment of African Americans, although better than it used to be, still plagued the country at that time. The civil rights reformers were motivated by a need to keep violence to a minimum in the streets of our nation. In the Kerner Report from our primary document readings, it states, "Rioting broke out in more than 100 cities following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The violence was not exclusive. It was occurring everywhere. I also believe that the actions of the activists motivated the reformers because of the attention it brought to them during this time." Bigger part in the civil rights reform. Although politicians played a part, they really only reacted to what the civil rights activists were doing. This was greatly demonstrated by the voice recordings of President Johnson with a number of his peers. Most were discussing an event, riot, murder, or issue that was caused that needed a game plan. This game of cause and effect leads me to believe that the activists were more influential in civil rights reforms. The activists were persistent in their goals of developing an equal world where people of all color and status could coexist peacefully. They hosted sit-ins, peaceful protests, marches, etc. just to have their movement be acknowledged. The national politicians involved themselves when they had to. The civil rights activists really made the issue unavoidable. The picture on this slide demonstrates one of the many ways Martin Luther King, who was one of the most influential civil rights activists, tried to create change.